Hello and welcome to the Digital Leader Show. Each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and the audio recording is available on major podcast platforms. This week we're discussing the rise and fall of the Chief Diversity Officer, plus headlines for digital leaders from the world of enterprise technology. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up the Institute for RPA and AI, as well as the Digital Enterprise Institute. We're a professional association, media, and peer-to-peer research network providing education, networking, and advice to over 130,000 members globally, all around automation, enterprise AI, and digital transformation. Check us out at irpaai.com or deinetwork.com. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga, a researcher and author, educator at the University of Maryland in Georgetown, and former EY and Accenture advisor. Good afternoon, Carlos.
Good afternoon, Dan. Good to be back.
How's the summer treating you?
Summer is good. Interesting summer as always. A little trip to Toronto last week, which was really fun. And now back in the US.
How was Toronto?
Toronto was nice. We didn't have the fire issue. I guess the Canadians are fine till the fires went south to New York. But Toronto itself was sunny, 80 degrees every day. So a really nice trip and always fun to go to Canada.
You follow the headlines in the last week? Been some interesting stuff going on.
There's always a lot of interesting stuff going on, right? You've got the market, of course, which is having happy days right now. Everybody's waiting for the Fed announcement at 2:00. Baked in a quarter raise. The question is, what's the guidance for the rest of the year? We talked about this before after the show last week. I'm a little bit sketchy on the valuation right now, on the levels, but everybody, nobody wants to miss out right at this point. So it's let's all pretend like everything's fine.
You're like Jim Cramer, sell. That's where you are.
We're within 5% of the all-time high, right? So at this point, you could clear and go to a 3-month T-bill and get 5% just about. So there are certainly the more cautious people. I think I might be moving some money into more safer places, but always fun to see what happens when it comes to the market.
It's always good. Always good to get free stock advice. So what's going on with your buddy at Twitter? I mean, he's like going X Games on us.
Yeah, there was a great article in the Atlantic yesterday that had sort of 3 theories about what's happening right at Twitter. None of them were good. So, and I don't understand why you ditch. Right. It's funny because this is the second time this year that a classic brand has been ditched. First, HBO was ditched for Max, which I didn't understand. Why would you keep Max? HBO has become the premier gold standard in television production. So that's the one you throw away, right? And you keep Max. And in this case, I guess he went on formerly, the artist formerly known as Twitter, and said, somebody make me a logo, as if he can't afford to hire a designer. And it's just this generic X. And so X, what's interesting, the article mentioned that, X was his first company. So Musk's very first thing was X,
right? Yeah.
X.com, right? And X didn't do well. He was fired by the board, right, of X, which then soon merged with another company, which then eventually became PayPal. So one kind of, I'd say, Shakespearean theory is that there's something in the back of his head wants to redeem what he considers to be maybe a blot on his resume, which was X.com. And one problem was apparently that people thought it was a pornographic site. So now we're back to this is the kind of I must redeem my ancient loss right against this foe. And that's the reason why it's X.com. So
I think he just wants to follow Zuckerberg, just do a major name change. And what's funny is I saw a post on LinkedIn, an attorney posted saying, just the legal aspects of trying to trademark something like X in especially in countries that don't have the same trademark laws that are in the U.S. But even for the U.S., I mean, his estimate was could be $100 million in legal fees alone.
Right, and it'll take 10 years because it's Apple's one, right? You get people come out of the woodwork all over the world saying, "Hey, listen, I've been ex dry cleaners right in Mozambique for 10 years, and so you can't have it." The other interesting thing that we're seeing is that X was a little bit of a jokey article, right? But X stands for the unknown, which the joke was it reflects their strategy. And so well,
That's funny.
it's a value to be filled in later. And the article mentioned that Zacharino, I guess, is the new CEO, right? That she said something like, "It's we're this platform will connect people in ways that can't be imagined." And the author said, "I'm going to take you at face value, which means that you can't imagine that nobody has." And so this is kind of like a placeholder for platform to be defined later. I last comment I'll make here, because how I feel about this whole entire project, which is Twitter had lots of problems, some of which I've written about. Guess what? Wasn't one of them, right? The name. And so why, and the logo, which I always thought was kind of a cool logo. Why of all things, right? Would you then decide that that's a priority at this point? Oh well.
Well, and to me, like you acquire something. Yeah, I mean, you acquire something. I mean, he spent a lot of money for Twitter, right? So you either you typically do that because you want to acquire the customer list. Okay, so maybe there's still a subscribership, although that's gone down. You invest because you acquire because of the brand has brand equity, or you do it because of revenue multiple. I mean, none of those things are still intact, right? The business has changed, the brand has changed, the subscribership is down. What's left? What left in that asset? I don't know. I don't
What's
get
the
it.
paper equity on the brand, right? And if you had said, let me sell the name, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a billion, easy, right? Of the valuations, $43 billion valuation. I can't imagine at least a billion was the concept of a tweet and the brand, and to just throw it away. Well, I guess if you're that rich, you can just throw away $1 billion worth of brand value without worrying about it. But yeah, like I said, X is hardly the name I would have come up with. But then again, right?
I think he wants to become a lazy girl. I think that's
I
the next part.
That must be it. Which is the other story of the week, which I found fascinating, right? This lazy girl jobs, this idea that there's this cadre of young women who have decided that they don't really want to work very hard. What they want is a job that pays reasonably well, not super well, but reasonably well, a nice boss to work for, and they can be out of the office by 5 o'clock at the latest, so they can do whatever else they've got going on, influencing or so it was. The back and forth was, this is kind of a sign of a new work life kind of perspective, or is it just take it again at face value? It's just lazy people who really don't want to work. So I'm sure some of the old schoolers who read the article were sort of jumping up and down when they were reading articles about this, right? You would never have
Yeah,
seen
to me,
those lazy boomer. You would never have seen the article. Oh, the newest trend among baby boomers is the lazy, right?
yeah, but that didn't happen, in a post-pandemic Great Resignation era either. So, and so there's a couple things here, right? I mean, I actually think it's a really interesting topic. We've talked a little about gig economy and
It's
stuff in
very
the past,
interesting.
but it's an interesting time. So, I think that there's three forces at play here, right? One is a Gen Z workforce, or lack thereof, that have never worked in a real office setting, right? And so they don't even know how it would work and how it would look. You have the Great Resignation thing where people are like, "Hey, wait a second, I shouldn't be treated like garbage. I want the flexibility. I want to work for myself. I'm not in an office anyway, so why can't I have multiple different gigs going on?" And then I think there's this influencer thing, with that's fueled by platforms like TikTok, not the only one, OnlyFans, where people are like, "Hey, I just want to be like this. I want to be the next Kardashian or whatever." That part's dangerous. I mean, I see merit in the entrepreneurial spirit of working for yourself and working from home and having work-life balance and seeing your family and not being on a plane 48 weeks out of the year. But my fear, and reading, I think CNN had an opinion piece about this morning. I think it was CNN. The vast majority of people quitting their jobs or not working, though, do not reach this level of success, right?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting, like you said, it's one of a set of phenomenon, right? That point to a different kind of perspective on work life, right? And what is work, and what is the role of a job and a career inside someone's life. There was for a long time, right, this sense of, okay, work defines you, especially in the US, which is more so than any place I've ever been to, right? The Anglo-Saxon countries for the most part have this sense of the first question you get asked is, what do you do? Which isn't the case in a lot of places. And so maybe this is just one more sign of a redefinition of kind of what the role that work plays in the future for a lot of people.
Yeah, and there's this battle obviously going on. It's been going on. We've talked about it. Between work from home and return to office. This is definitely part of that battle. It seems like work from home is winning, but it depends on the headline, depends on the day. I was actually recently introduced to a company that's built a kind of hybrid platform for that kind of bridges the gap between employers who want the ability to knock on a door and see somebody in an office and create that collaboration and efficiency, but also allows people to work from home. So very different than Teams and Zoom and being completely virtual. So it's actually an interesting compromise. I wonder if technologies like, maybe I'll get them on the show, technologies like that may actually bridge the gap, but right now it's kind of like the old way or the new way. And I think especially for the younger generations, that's an easy decision, at least until they can't move out of their parents' house. Then maybe things change.
Well, that's the other thing too, right? There was this traditional sense that the reason why you worked, quote unquote, like a slave, right, especially when you're young, is because there was this promise of this big payout, the partnership, the whatever, right? Your life was going to be better. More and more you read, this might be the first generation or generations that won't live as well as their parents. So if the payout down the road, right now, it's just maybe it's unintentionally a very explainable economic calculation. If there isn't this big payout in lifestyle coming from me, if because of national debt or climate change or whatever, right, the curve has now inverted, then why am I going to kill myself when the outcome isn't going to be better than what the payout at the end of the 30 years isn't what it was going to be. And I have a good friend of mine who's an ENT surgeon, and when he got out of Hopkins, he bought into a practice out in Reno, right? And he's built this practice with his partner over the years. And now they were thinking about, they got approached by a private equity firm to sell the practice. And what was interesting, he said, we don't really want to sell. Our thought was always that there would be some young doctors who come in and they would do what we did. They would buy into the practice and they would take over. But the young doctors don't want to buy in. They don't think it's going to be worth, it won't appreciate the way it has for us, right? For because down the road there'll be socialized medicine or whatever. And so what they want is a salary. They don't want to work the way we worked, right? Because this is a guy who works long hours every day to build his practice. And he said they just don't want the same deal. Right?
Yeah.
They don't want to buy in. They don't want it. For them, it's like a mortgage, right? And so they're just asking for a salary, a nice quality of life, and so in that case, right, selling to a PE firm makes a lot of sense because it fits our economics. We'll get whatever we get from them. It's only going to go down. Looks like.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Well, listen, you had two choices back then, right? You had the choice of working for a big employer or going out into private practice, and the whole American dream of owning your own business and owning your own practice. I think the difference is there's a third option now where at least in theory, the lazy girl job, exists. You can, everything's so democratized, AI and work, technology, internet access, compute, all this stuff is so democratized where really anybody can start a business now, maybe without that taking out a mortgage concept and working your whole life to build a practice. I mean, I even have looked at, businesses where it's like, does it even make sense to have employees, to take on overhead, in this economy, right? What's the incentive?
the other thing is that when I think when boomers thought of a business, they thought of a business, right? A shop and employees. When you talk to Gen Zers, and I took them in the journalism program, right, and undergraduates, a business is that they're a business, right?
Yeah.
So the influencer sees him or herself as a personal brand, a personal business,
Yeah.
right? So they don't need the traditional company structure. A business can be someone who produces content, right, and gets paid six figures to produce content. So in that world, right, the definition of what a business is, I don't have a business, I am a business, right? And
Yep.
so that's something that used to be a remote thing for people who are entertainers, right, or a few artists. Today, anybody can come out of college and say, I don't need the entire corporate thing, right? My real dream is to create some content or whatever generation model that supports me on my own. And in that case, the lazy job isn't lazy at all, right? The lazy job is simply a stipend while I figure out my influencer model, my newsmaker model, my whatever model that's going to allow me to be self-sufficient going forward. And by the way, in a world where you're being told AI is going to eat your job anyway, it may be a perfectly rational reaction. I don't want to do Microsoft, right? Because or wherever, because what's the point of investing 10 years
Yeah.
in corporate? Pick your corporation because the AI is coming for the job anyway.
I agree. I think the problem that we have to figure out as a society is if that's the case, then you don't have people or companies investing in the way that they used to, right? So, real estate as an industry, other capital investments, right? So you really have to. The economy is kind of evolving then to an as a service economy where I can get a tool for $99 a month that I used to have to spend 20 grand up front to invest in. So if you're not in the subscription or as a service business, I think it becomes tougher. The other piece is, it's ironic. We talked last week about, government technology, but in a lot of ways, I think the government, has created this situation, right? They've, largely have made it very difficult for people to open businesses and file taxes and hire employees. And they just, anybody who's ever run a business, it's hard. Like they make it very, very complicated to, run and operate a business, at least the way they want you to. So you look at that and then you look at the alternative and you say, that's a no brainer.
Right. There was an interesting, somewhat like a story in the journal this week about Bath and Body Works and their effort to reshore their production, right, of certain products and all the things they had to go through to get a factory built. I think it's in Ohio.
Yep.
That,
Columbus. Yep.
right, that would be able to make their products here in the U.S. And one of the things talked about was having to spend hour after hour talking about the cosmetics of the plant with local officials and how they wanted it to look a certain way. That they go to Vietnam or to, kudos to them, right? Because almost any other place would say, we don't care what color it is, just put the factory and make the jobs. But here, there were a lot of things they had to go through. They stuck with the plan and it seems to have worked for them. So it's an interesting article if you want to understand, okay, what does it really take? Why does outsourcing exist? And what would it take? And this is not a complex product. They were talking about, for example, a hand soap, and it's a bottle with a pump, whatever. Um, when you think about something like a computer, right, or other things, you get a sense of the complexity of what it would take to reassure some of these jobs. At the end of the day, the answer, as the article notes, wasn't labor; it was automation.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you
That was one. And the other takeaway for me was that, at some point they had to go to these suppliers and
Yep.
say, hey, we want you to stop doing it in Vietnam. Not only do we want to stop doing it in Vietnam, we want you to stop doing it at that plant that's like 2 hours away because we want you to do it on property with us.
On the camp.
So everything's within a mile. And those suppliers had to make a decision about whether they were willing to make that, back to that word, investment, right? They had a significant risky investment, which I'm sure is paying back dividends now. But at the time, if you said to me, hey, you got to, invest, I don't know what it was, $100 million, couple $100 million to build another facility that you don't really need right now to keep
Right.
our business, that's a big investment that they made, right?
And a final point was that they had a strategy in mind, right? What drove it was the sense that the lead time in their world, if you're sourcing in China, you get months and months of lead time. In this case, the fact that they can go to a store, invent a product, and have it out in a matter of weeks was the strategic driver, right? So this was to them as much of a way to enable a different way of competing, which seems right in the early days to be working out for them. But there was a very strong strategic reason for what they did, But it's a very interesting story. Again, if you want to understand, just what would it take for
Yeah.
some bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.
Well, it's also interesting. We talked in the past too. I was doing some work with a supply chain company, and I think you were one. And a couple other people basically said, "Listen, no matter how good you get at technology, you're never going to be able to avoid situations like the Suez Canal and COVID and things like that. So now you bring this local, right, and put everything in the same site. Very interesting strategy, alternative strategy to doing everything, far shore, offshore."
By the way, I will mention one other thing, completely different topic, and that was Oppenheimer. I had a chance to see the film over the
Oh,
weekend.
don't tell me. I'm seeing it Monday.
Right. All I'll say is that there it is
I
this
don't know
sort
what
of
happens. I don't know how.
this, yeah, I don't see how it ends, right? And so there is this parallel question of someone who created something very powerful and then spent the rest of his life kind of almost, I want to say, apologizing for it or trying to control it, right? And there are, I know there are intentional, right, echoes to the whole AI question that sort of run through the movie. And anyway, if you haven't seen, I think almost everybody has by now, but I would definitely recommend it. It's long, but at no point did I think it was sort of waning. And so the questions it raises were really well handled, and I thought it was excellent piece of work.
Interesting. All right, I'm going to watch it, and we'll talk about it
We'll
next
talk
week.
about it after you see it. There you go.
Thank you. So the main topic this week is this concept, this idea that the chief diversity officer and some of the things that go along with that may be waning in corporate America. There's a stunning article in
Yeah.
Wall Street Journal about the waning corporate sentiment around diversity policies and hiring, and you take that, you say, okay, that's maybe one anecdote, and then you couple that with the Supreme Court striking down affirmative action in education, and then you start seeing this theme maybe emerging.
Right, and I think this is one thing that's if you're close to this role, and I think back to my time I was working with a private executive group, right? You got to get to see it up close. You sort of knew the clock was ticking on this job. They were there were two roles that were really um, so let's say broadly defined. You might say undefined in some cases. One was the sustainability officer, the other one was the diversity officer, right? And it would be different. CFOs are CFOs for the most part. This role could be almost anything depending on what company you worked in. In some places it was very important, in some places it wasn't. I think that the challenge became that an industry grew up right around DEI and became self-sustaining. And it's been well documented that you get to the point where people just want to get paid to keep the problem alive or to pretend to keep the problem alive. And then also people didn't see kind of where all this is going. And for me, the one thing I didn't read in this article, and I say it all the time because I've spoken on this topic a few times, is that we ignore the economics of diversity, right? And the way I explained it at a conference one time was, if you think about consulting and you say, what does a seat in a consulting firm, what's the net present value, right? So what's it worth from a cash flow perspective? You say an associate, post MBA, first job out of business school, right? You're going to have that job 3 or 4 years. Let's say you make between 1 and 150 a year, so that job is worth about $1 million, right? So okay, you then go to, let's say, project manager, $2 to $3 million, director, $5 to $10 million over the lifetime of that role, right? By the time you get to like junior partner, you're getting into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, partner into the millions, right? Senior partner, tens of millions. And so what happens? Diversity, very evident at the lower ranks, right? When I was in consulting, the higher you went, the lower the diversity. Why? Because the chair, a senior partner chair, was worth tens of millions of dollars. That's in consulting firms, in corporates, right? It could be hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the question of who's going to give up, right, that chair that's going to be worth 10, 20, $30 million of income, right, over your lifetime for quote unquote diversity. And it was something that I never saw really discussed, right, in these conferences and sessions. And so I think that ultimately the economics pushed back because people didn't want to do it. It was too much at stake. The offices failed, as the article notes, in many cases. They either didn't have a clarity of vision, didn't get much accomplished. And so now you begin to see this sort of retrenchment where the jobs are being curtailed, in some cases eliminated, and people are leaving to do other things. Like you said, couple that with the broader societal sort of swing, right, that you saw in this affirmative action case. which is just again a related topic. Uh, you get a you get what you explain in this article.
So you're saying you actually saw this happening
Yeah.
before it ended up in the journal, right?
Yep.
Because my thought, seeing this from the outside, because I did not see that. I'm not that ingrained in those organizations, at least from that, those departments. When we're working with technology and operations groups, but that is something that seems to me is becoming more and more um of a controversial area, right? I mean, if you saw what happened, and we talked about what happened with Bud Light, with Anheuser-Busch, and some of those other initiatives where they've become very, very polarizing. And so you wonder if these companies actually want to go the opposite. They want to avoid this concept altogether at this point, right? It's too much of a hot button issue. You don't want to lose half your customer segment.
And I think in a lot of cases it was window dressing, right? Because we know, I always use the example of a different kind of diversity. Companies can fix diversity when they have to in a hurry. They don't need CDOs and 10 years of trying, right? Let's just take the example where you've got a customer base that's too concentrated. Like all your money comes from one or two customers. So you want a diversity of customers, right? So the CEO comes in and goes, you know what? Within 1 year, I want us to have 3 times as many customers. I don't want to be dependent on one customer in case they decide to cut our business or whatever. Watch how quickly that happens. If you need diversity in the customer base, it's a 12-month process. Apparently, if you need it in the boardroom, it's a 10-year process. And so this is the thing that I think people begin to understand is that, look, we're talking a lot about this, but we're not really getting anywhere, right? Other than here and there examples that are made. Okay, where is the big change? And I think part of the problem was I still honestly, and I've read a lot on this topic, I still have yet to see a really like scientific, compelling, business-centric argument for the existence of this role, right? You get parallels and analogies and metaphors, right? But what is it, right? Spelled out for people that makes the case compelling to people who look at this from a dollars and cents standpoint. Right?
So do you think there's maybe not a direct connection then between an organization having a chief diversity officer and their diversity hiring practices, or you're saying the whole program as a whole is not
I think
effective?
it's a cultural issue, right? I was at a conference one time that was organized by two, Fortune 50 companies. And they asked me to come as an advisor. And what was interesting was that they were all these speakers. And honestly, the speakers were all forgettable, right? It was a bunch of kind of cliches and platitudes. Nobody said anything really. And then they had a professor who ran a, a very successful biopharma lab at a university. And they showed the picture of his team and the professors from Puerto Rico. And the team was a very different Europeans, Africans, and then they asked him, "Wow, you must have a really successful diversity program." He goes, "I don't have any at all." And the guy was actually kind of shocked by the question because I just picked the best applicants. The picture you see worked out because we hire the best people we can. It just worked out that it's a diverse team. We didn't start with a diverse team as our goal. We started with the best team as a goal, and so. That was actually the most illuminating comment. Maybe the issue isn't diversity. Maybe the issue is that you have things that prevent you from hiring and acquiring the best candidates. If you did, you would have a diverse workforce, right? So diverse workforce is the outcome of a well-run company, not the object, right? Possibly.
That's
So,
interesting.
and I think that's the case that hasn't been, when you say diversity for its own sake, that's where I think people get a little bit worried because that case hasn't been made as well as it could be, right? And it isn't like a non-diverse group can't do something great. You think about the Apollo program, right? It's the example was used. I'm watching that great documentary Apollo 11, and there's a scene where they show the control room, right? And I mean, it is all white guys, right? And so now I know that the stories haven't been told. We saw it in Hidden Figures. There were probably people
Yep.
who were really important whose stories haven't yet been communicated. So put a footnote with that one, right? But was it primarily a diverse team? No, they put somebody in the moon. The question to me is maybe what they had was they had diversity, as we see in Apollo 11, the movie, right? Apollo 13, sorry. a diversity of opinions, of thoughts, of ways of solving problems, even if demographically, right, they were the same. One of the critiques I've seen in this topic is, what good is it if you hire different people from different demographic groups if they all think the same? They all went to the same schools. They all have the same viewpoint, right? It's diversity of thought, life experience, perspectives that may be more important than the wrapper that comes in.
So
And that
do you think that this role was created and that the companies that hired people in this role, do you think that they were well intentioned in doing it and it just didn't play out, or do you think it was just a marketing stunt to say, hey, I want to see some colors and different genders on this corporate website?
my personal, and it's 100% personal opinion, if it's a few of the former, a lot of the latter, because a lot of companies are, the corporate world is a copycat world, right? So if they find out, oh, wow, right, Google hired a CDO, where I better go hire one too, because I don't want to get a call from the Wall Street Journal asking me, why don't you have a CDO? So as we know, right, Dan, most executives at a high level are pretty risk averse, right? They did a lot to get to where they are, and they're not in the habit of wanting to lose it. And so if suddenly pay to play becomes, you have to have a chief sustainability officer or diversity officer, then you're going to get one and kind of go from there. So I think, not that there weren't people who actually genuinely believed this was going to be a good thing, but I'm going to guess them. I didn't suggest to guess, right? I'm not a scholar of this space. I follow it, but I don't study it. It's a big distinction I would make. That I think, from what I saw anecdotally, right, the reactions were, well, we should have one, because if we don't, we're going to get asked why we don't have one.
Yeah.
Right. Now the question becomes, okay, what do you really accomplish, right? And they're very tough questions. I remember at this conference that I mentioned, because I was on one of the advisors, they had breakouts, and in the breakouts you had to meet with, and everybody at the conference was for minorities, right, underrepresented groups, and women. And so in the breakouts, you had to meet with a group of about 4 or 5 people, and they would ask for advice, right? And one person, I will not forget her. She came in, she's a supply chain director sort of level person, right? Black female, and she talked about how her boss was a hardcore racist. And she made this strong case that she was at a dead end job because she couldn't leave because her boss was not like pretend racist. I mean, like all out, right? And she felt like she had nowhere to go in the company. And you think, okay, they're paying for this fancy diversity conference, and yet you got a person who feels, hey, I've got a hardcore racist as a manager, and I don't know what to do. This is what I don't understand. And I think this is part of it, right? Okay, there was money to have conferences, there was money to have training, there was money to bring in speakers, right? But in the meantime, where there are really serious issues, apparently there was no mechanism for that, or at least for this person, it seemed like it was failing.
Well, you said something similar about the ESG initiatives, right? It was almost more about just doing it so you could say that you did it and you invested X amount of dollars into it versus actually changing anything.
Yeah, and I think this other thing of, my impression from my consulting days was, when I was a junior consultant, was there hardcore, actual, like old school racism? Yes, 100%, absolutely. By the time I left consulting, was this as evident? Probably not, I would say. I think the industry had done a good job of eliminating what I would call like the serious institutional sort of racist perspectives. However, biases were still there. And what does that mean, right? Bias says, look, I don't dislike that group, but I prefer this group, right? And I use the analogy: if you get on a plane for a long haul flight, and the flight attendant says there are 2 open seats, grab whichever one you want, right? And one seat next to one seat, right, is somebody who you think looks kind of weird, and you don't like kind of how they're dressed, and they got their stuff on your seat, and you're sort of, this is going to be an unpleasant thing. On the other side, you've got somebody who's reading a book you just finished and you like, who looks like you, who kind of
yeah. It's like the minorities in an alley,
yes,
analogy,
right.
right?
If you grab that seat, right? So that's bias. Bias is if you grab that seat. Racism is if you refuse the other one, right? So I think what you have, and this is a tougher problem to solve, is to say, okay, so much of consulting was unwritten things like, who do you mentor? Who do you spend time with, right? Who do you make that extra effort for? And I wonder if those issues, which are so complex, right? Uh, they're so complex that these diversity sort of teams, either couldn't or weren't able to do this, and that's the next frontier. I remember talking to the diversity officer of a big tech company, and she had mentioned a really interesting program they had, which was an outreach program. So they went to their C-suite and said, "Listen, we're not going to fire you," because they asked them, "How many of you have a diverse set of friends and acquaintances outside of the office?" Right, and the answer, of course, was, because it was a tech company, most of them said no. So they said, "Well, we're not going to ding you for that, but we're going to ask you to meet people who are not like you." So they set up a program where they would meet. In some cases, they were journalists or ministers or artists or people who came from different backgrounds, with the hope that, listen, as you get to know people who are not like you, you may come back to the office and suddenly feel more comfortable mentoring, right, or supporting someone who isn't like you, which is probably not the case today. So there might be more complex issues of how do you help somebody move up the ladder, right? That aren't really addressed by these programs. And it may be not that, maybe what we're seeing, right, is that diversity 1.0 is kind of run its course. And maybe we'll get a second version of this that will be a little more nuanced and deal with these other kind of issues that are a little bit harder.
So do you think it's an issue that still needs addressed? And if so, how so? Like, you look at, like, I spoke a couple weeks ago at a women in technology event. And I had to look up all these stats about, how, the lack of parity of women, to men in STEM, in technology in particular, and how, salaries and those things. So is your feeling that just doesn't need to be addressed, or shouldn't be addressed at the corporate level?
I think that it comes down to the story I told a minute ago, which was, okay, if the process is a neutral process, right, and women make up more than half the population of America, and now are a majority of college graduates, then it stands to reason that you would have 50% female CEOs, female board members, female directors.
But you
That
don't need to catch up, so to speak.
Yeah, right. That would just happen if the process were sort of clean, right? The fact that we're nowhere near that says that the process isn't neutral. That's the issue. So as long as the fact that we're getting an unequal outcomes, some that suggests to me that there are things in the structure, right, that are not allowing this to happen. Because we can show one or two CEOs who are women and they're high profile, we now think, okay, this is great. Jenny Ramadi is running whatever. So, but wait a minute, right? You're talking about people who are the Mary Bears of the world. Yeah, that's a small, but if you look at the total population, right, we've moved the needle, but nowhere near where it would be if all things were equal. And
But
that's
isn't that the idea of a chief diversity officer? I know I'm going full circle, but isn't that the idea?
well, that was the question, was how, right? How do you do that? Where is the issue? Right? And that's when I say one problem was in sitting in these conferences and meetings was that the economics of this, who's going, like, it's a zero-sum game, right, Dan? C-suite chairs aren't added for you. You take one that's already there, right? They come here and there, but for the most part, right, they don't just add another chair in the C-suite or in the boardroom. So these are worth hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. So who gives that up, right? Who gives it up? What white male gives up that chair willingly for the good of diversity, right? If that's really what that's the reality of what has to happen. You can't just keep adding chairs because you want a more diverse boardroom. Somebody who was going to get that chair doesn't. And again, we go back to biases. Look at how board directors are often selected, right? Oh, I know somebody. How many people do you know that got a job at a senior place or in a board because the person already on the board
Oh
tells us,
yeah, they didn't find them on Indeed, that's for sure.
right? Everyone on Indeed, right? Yeah, on LinkedIn, right? So, oh yeah, my buddy Paul went to blank school with me, right? Yeah, he'll be great. And then it gets sort of worked that way. I remember reading a study a few years ago, or after I was talking to a female executive who told me that when and she's a C-suite person, right? I think CIO, that she gets a call from a recruiter to put her hat in a ring, right, for a new job, I'll always ask, if she's the only female candidate, right? Serious female candidate kind of on the list. Um, because if it was one, she always got passed up. Um, it took two or three to be on the list to raise the odds dramatically that a female candidate would be selected. Because if it was one, her impression was they think I'm just the token on the list.
Oh, gotcha.
Right. When it was two, they couldn't spot the token.
Right.
Right. That's what she thought. So now they got to look at it carefully. And so I think that there are, again, right, mechanical issues, procedural issues, just human nature issues. And look, we understand, right? The person who went to college, who went to whatever Wharton, 20 years ago, yeah, of course they're going to be a film. If it's a person, right, who will say, yeah, somebody who went to school with me, one of my old classmates, right, is the person I would go with. But okay, is that really the way to do it? It's funny to read how many Silicon Valley stories the founders and co-founders went to school together.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Especially tech. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, okay, that's just human nature. Going back to what is the job of diversity, right? Is it to stop that from happening? Is it to broaden somebody's horizons? Like the quota thing, nobody likes. So what are you trying to do with this role? Is the question. I've never been clear about what the job is for, right? Again, like sustainability, you go into some place and sustainability officer, I spoke to the CEO almost on a regular basis, and it was a hardcore, serious job. In other places, it was, I have sustainability and this and that and diversity, right? 25 things, none of which really meant much. Yeah. So again, this article, I was surprised to see it. I wasn't surprised that it was written, because I think that this is an edifice that's been crumbling. And by the way, critiqued by some of its own principles, right? There was an article, Atlantic, a few months ago about that was from, not a anti-diversity publication that had a similar theme of, look, where are we going with all this? So,
well, and this is all from the corporate, leadership standpoint. The other angle, which maybe makes this moot at some point, is if the Supreme Court's going to go after it in education, is the corporate world next? Or they just make it illegal to have affirmative action within hiring practices?
Yeah, and it's everything we've read is that people are already sort of following this, right? What's interesting is unintended consequences of the Supreme Court decision. You saw the legacy admissions has now become a thing, right? And the Harvard's programs in the scrutiny, a couple of schools announced it. I think Wellesley even announced that they were going to eliminate, preferred admission for legacies. So maybe the schools are trying to find other ways of doing what they're doing. But you're right. I think that the Supreme Court decision sets a broad tone to saying that how we've tackled this problem hasn't worked, and people are getting hurt in the process. And so now let's go back to the drawing board of this. And I think companies paid a lot of attention to this. And it's no surprise that this article came out about a month after that decision. Right.
Yeah.
Not before. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that's our time. Great discussion, Carlos. And we'll be back next Wednesday live at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, as always. And in the meantime, if you're looking for help with something, we're still offering free coaching sessions and state-of-the-industry briefings on a variety of digital transformation, automation, and AI use cases. So ping me or go to irpaai.com if you want to schedule that. In the meantime, Carlos, I don't know, by next week, you might have written another book or something.
Well, I'll stick with the first one, which releases August 9th. And again, those of you who want to follow me on Substack, it's just look up my name, Carlos Varanga, on Substack.com. See you then. And see you next week.
Have a great week. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.